The rain fell in thin, greasy sheets, plastering discarded newspapers to the sidewalk and turning the neon glow of the diner's sign into a blurry watercolor of pink and blue. From his alcove across the street, Arthur watched it. The diner was a ship of warmth and light in the cold, dark sea of the night. Inside, people laughed, their voices a muffled murmur behind the glass. Their hands wrapped around thick ceramic mugs of coffee that steamed and promised a temporary reprieve from the world's damp chill. Arthur's own hands were tucked into the threadbare pockets of his army surplus jacket, the fabric so worn it felt more like a memory of warmth than a provider of it. The cold wasn't just on his skin. It was a deep, settled thing in his bones, a resident that had long since stopped paying rent. He had tried the diner an hour ago. Hope, a stubborn and foolish weed, had pushed him toward the door. Maybe just a cup of hot water. Maybe the leftovers someone had left on a plate. But Silas, the owner, had met him at the threshold. Silas was a man whose body had been softened by years of his own greasy cooking, but whose eyes were as hard and sharp as broken glass. He'd looked Arthur up and down, his gaze a physical thing that catalogued the matted gray beard, the faded jacket, the profound weariness in his eyes. "Not tonight, old man," Silas had grunted, his hand already on Arthur's shoulder, a firm, dismissive pressure. "You'll scare off the regulars." The shame was a familiar heat that rose in Arthur's chest, a useless fire against the pervasive cold. He hadn't argued. He hadn't pleaded. He had simply turned and walked back into the rain, the sound of a few snickering patrons following him like a volley of stones. Now he watched them, the ones who belonged, the ones who were not scary. He saw them complain about the coffee being too weak, push a half-eaten slice of pie away, leave crumpled bills on the table for food they barely touched. He felt no anger, only a vast, hollow ache. It was the way of things. Some were inside and some were outside. He had been on both sides of that window in his life, and he knew how easy it was to forget the other existed. The conflict wasn't just with Silas or the laughing patrons. It was with the world itself, a world that had deemed him invisible. He was a ghost haunting the edges of a life he used to know. People's eyes slid right over him, their gazes refusing to land, as if acknowledging his existence might be a contagion. Silas hadn't just denied him entry. He had denied his humanity, reducing him to a piece of unpleasant scenery to be moved along. When Silas had shoved him, it wasn't with malice, but with the same casual impatience one might use on a stray dog nosing at the garbage cans. The shove had sent Arthur stumbling back a step, the slick pavement nearly taking his feet out from under him. He'd caught his balance, the motion slow and tired, and in that moment, he'd met the eyes of a woman sitting in a booth by the window. She was holding a coffee cup, her lipstick a perfect red crescent on the white ceramic. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something: pity? Disgust? Before she looked away, suddenly fascinated by the sugar dispenser on her table. That was the real blow. The shove was just physics. The averted gaze was a verdict. It declared him unworthy of a moment's consideration, a problem to be ignored until it went away. He was a ripple in their placid evening, and they were all waiting for the water to go still again. He retreated to the shadowed doorway across the street, the damp brick seeping cold into his back. He wasn't just outside the diner, he was outside everything. The laughter from within, the warm glow, the smell of frying bacon that hung in the air. It all belonged to a different universe, one for which he no longer had a key. The rain was his reality, the cold his companion, and the gnawing hunger a constant, dull reminder of his station. He pulled the collar of his jacket tighter, a futile gesture, and settled in to wait for the night to pass, just as he had waited for so many nights before. He didn't think about it often, but tonight, the cold and the hunger gnawed at the walls he'd built around his memories. He had not always been this man, this ghost in a worn-out coat. There was a time when his hands were steady and sure, not trembling from cold and malnutrition. They had been a surgeon's hands, or close enough. Combat medic. He could still feel the phantom weight of a field dressing kit, the specific way a tourniquet had to be twisted, the slick warmth of blood under his fingers. He had held the hands of dying boys who called out for their mothers in the dust of a country they couldn't find on a map. He had whispered reassurances he didn't believe, his own fear a cold knot in his gut, but his voice had never wavered. He had a duty, to his men, to the promise of seeing them home. And before that there was Eleanor. Her memory was the most painful and the most precious. She smelled of lavender and sunshine, and her laugh could make the most cynical parts of him believe in simple joy. They had a small house with a porch swing and a garden where the tomatoes never grew quite right, but they ate them anyway, laughing. He had promised her he would come home. He did. But the man who returned was not the same one who had left. The war had followed him, a silent, shadowy passenger. It sat with him at the dinner table, it lay between them in bed, it whispered to him in the dead of night. He'd tried. He'd worked jobs, a security guard, a stocker at a grocery store, but the crowds, the loud noises, the sudden movements would send him spiraling back to the chaos. The ghosts of the boys he couldn't save were more real to him than the customers asking where to find the cereal. Eleanor had been patient. She held him during the nightmares, her love a lighthouse in his personal storm. "It's okay, Arthur," she'd whisper, her hand on his cheek. "You're home. You're safe." But then she got sick. A quiet, insidious illness that stole her light piece by piece. The medical bills mounted. A tsunami of paper that swept away their savings. Then their house. He'd held her hand in a sterile hospital room, the beeping of machines the only soundtrack to their final days. Her last words to him were not of fear or regret. She'd looked at him, her eyes clear for a moment, and said, "Be the good in the world, Arthur, even when it's hard." Especially then. After she was gone, the shadows won. The world without her in it was too sharp, too loud. Too much. The jobs stopped sticking. The last of the money went to her debts. One day, he found himself with a single bag of belongings and nowhere to go. The street had taken him then. It was easier, in a way. The invisibility people afforded him was a kind of armor. They couldn't hurt what they didn't see. He kept his promise to Eleanor in small ways. He'd share a scavenged sandwich with a stray dog. He'd help an old woman pick up her dropped groceries, expecting nothing in return. He held onto his dignity like a shield, keeping himself clean as he could at public shelters, speaking politely when spoken to, never begging, only accepting what was offered. This quiet strength was all he had left of the man he used to be, the man Eleanor had loved. It was a flickering candle in the hurricane of his life, and he guarded it with everything he had. The pressure of the night was building into a physical force. The rain, once a steady drizzle, had intensified into a driving, relentless downpour. The wind howled through the canyon of buildings, turning the alleyway into a wind tunnel that ripped at Arthur's thin jacket and sent icy tendrils of water down his neck. His shelter in the recessed doorway was failing. Puddles were forming around his worn-out boots, and he could feel the dampness seeping through the cracked leather, a slow, creeping chill that was beginning to feel permanent. The hunger, once a dull ache, had sharpened into a painful cramp in his stomach. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, surviving on half a bagel he'd found in a bin and the kindness of a woman who'd given him a granola bar yesterday afternoon. His body was starting to protest in earnest, his energy reserves depleted. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he leaned his head back against the cold, wet brick, closing his eyes. It was in these moments of utter despair that the temptation to give up was strongest. To just lie down and let the cold take him. It would be a quiet end, a final surrender. No more hunger, no more shame, no more memories. He thought of Eleanor's final words, "Be the good in the world." It was a difficult mantra to hold onto when the world seemed to offer nothing but hardship in return. He fumbled in his inside pocket, his numb fingers searching for a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't paper. It was a dollar bill, crumpled, soft as old linen, and damp from the encroaching rain. He unfolded it carefully. It was his last one. He'd been saving it, waiting for a moment of absolute emergency, a moment when this single dollar could mean the difference between one more day and the end. He had planned to use it in the morning for a cup of coffee at the gas station. They had a 99-cent special. Just to feel the warmth in his hands, to have a reason to be inside for 10 minutes. This single dollar was his entire net worth. It was a symbol of his last vestige of participation in the world of commerce, of society. With it, he could buy something, however small. Without it, he was completely dependent on chance and charity. He stared at the faded portrait of George Washington, the paper so worn it was almost translucent. This was it. This was the bottom. The rain hammered down, the wind tore at him, and the lights of the diner across the street seemed to mock him with their cheerful, indifferent glow. He clutched the dollar in his fist, the paper a fragile anchor in the storm of his misery. The crisis was no longer just about being hungry or cold. It was about the crushing weight of his own insignificance. He was a man with $1 and a promise he was struggling to keep, stranded on the shore of a world that had sailed on without him. A new sound cut through the rhythm of the storm, the guttural, sputtering cough of a powerful engine failing. It was a roar that died into a wheeze, followed by a string of frustrated curses that were nearly swallowed by the wind. Arthur opened his eyes and peered out from his alcove. A motorcycle, a massive beast of chrome and black leather, was coasting to a stop directly under a flickering streetlight in front of the diner. The rider was a mountain of a man, clad head to toe in leather adorned with patches Arthur couldn't quite make out in the rain. The man swung a heavy leg over the bike and landed on the pavement with a thud. He tried the kickstart, his powerful leg pumping uselessly. The engine gave a pathetic groan and then fell silent. The man slammed his fist onto the gas tank, the metallic clang echoing down the empty street. He looked around, his gaze sweeping past Arthur's alcove without registering him, and settled on the diner. Then he noticed the payphone on the corner, an ancient, forgotten relic from a bygone era. He strode toward it, his boots heavy on the wet asphalt, then stopped, patting his leather vest and jeans. He was searching his pockets, a look of growing aggravation on his face. Arthur watched, his own misery momentarily forgotten. He knew that feeling of a desperate search for something that wasn't there. The big man was stuck. His bike was dead, the rain was torrential, and he clearly didn't have a quarter for the phone. Something shifted in Arthur. It was the medic in him, the man who saw someone in need. It was the husband in him, the man who had promised Eleanor he would be the good in the world. This man was not cold or hungry, but he was stranded. He was in a fix, and Arthur, in all his poverty and powerlessness, had a solution. He looked down at the crumpled dollar bill in his hand. His 99-cent coffee, his one small comfort for the morning, his last piece of the world. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and stepped out of the shadows and into the rain. He walked slowly toward the biker, who turned as he approached, his posture immediately defensive. The man was huge, his face framed by a thick, grizzled beard, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He looked like he could break Arthur in half without a second thought. Arthur stopped a few feet away, holding up his hand in a gesture of peace. He didn't speak. He simply unfolded the damp dollar bill and held it out. The biker stared at him, then at the dollar, then back at Arthur's face. Confusion warred with suspicion in his eyes. "What's this for?" he growled, his voice a low rumble like loose gravel. "The phone," Arthur said, his own voice raspy from disuse. He nodded toward the payphone. "You might need change. This will get you some." Inside, he gestured to the diner. The biker's gaze was intense. He wasn't looking at Arthur like Silas had. He wasn't looking through him. He was looking at him. He saw the soaked jacket, the gaunt cheeks, the profound exhaustion in his eyes. He saw the trembling hand offering the single, pathetic dollar, a gesture of pure, unadulterated sacrifice. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this was likely the last dollar this man had in the world. For a long moment, the only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the distant hum of the diner's sign. The biker didn't move. He just stared, his mind processing the impossible kindness he was being shown by a man who had nothing. The biker, whose name was Preacher, didn't take the dollar. Not at first. He held Arthur's gaze, and in that moment, the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The rain, the cold, the dead motorcycle. It all faded into the background. Preacher saw past the tattered clothes and the gray beard. He saw the unwavering dignity in the man's posture, the clear, honest intent in his eyes. This wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a beggar hoping for a larger reward. It was a pure, simple act of human decency, offered from a place of absolute destitution. Preacher had spent his life in a world of hard men, where respect was earned through strength and loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold. He knew posturing. He knew manipulation. This was neither. This was quiet honor. From inside the diner, Silas watched the scene unfold, a contemptuous sneer on his face. He saw the big, intimidating biker and the nuisance bum, and he assumed it was a shakedown. "Look at that," he muttered to the waitress, a young woman named Chloe. "The trash is attracting flies." A few customers chuckled, turning to look out the window at the strange tableau under the streetlight. They saw the giant biker and the homeless man, a single flimsy dollar bill held between them, and they drew their own conclusions, colored by their comfortable distance and their full stomachs. They saw a predator and a victim, a transaction of the street they didn't need to understand. Preacher finally reached out, but his hand didn't take the dollar. Instead, he gently closed Arthur's fingers back around it. "You keep that, brother," he said, his voice softer now, the gravelly edge gone. "You need it more than I do." He paused, his eyes scanning Arthur's face again, imprinting it on his memory. "What's your name?" "Arthur," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Preacher?" the biker said, extending a large, calloused hand. Arthur hesitated for a second before taking it. The grip was firm, warm, and respectful. It was the first time someone had shaken his hand in years. "My bike's flooded. I'll handle it. But I appreciate the offer, Arthur. More than you know." Preacher turned and gave his bike a single, expertly aimed kick in just the right spot. The engine, against all odds, sputtered to life with a deafening roar. He swung his leg over, the leather creaking. Before he put his helmet on, he looked back at Arthur, who was still standing in the rain, clutching his dollar. Preacher gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of thanks. It was a nod of acknowledgement. Promise. Then he twisted the throttle, and the motorcycle disappeared into the rainy darkness, its taillight a receding red star. Arthur stood there for a long moment, the warmth of the handshake still tingling in his palm. He felt the wet dollar in his other hand. Nothing had physically changed. He was still cold, still hungry, still homeless. But something inside him had shifted. Someone had seen him, not as a bum, not as a problem, but as a man. He turned and shuffled back to his alcove, the whispers from the diner patrons following him, their tone no longer mocking, but confused. They had witnessed something they couldn't categorize, a moment that didn't fit their neat, simple narrative of the world. The seed of doubt had been planted. The next morning, the sun rose weak and watery, trying its best to burn through the lingering gray clouds. The street was clean, washed by the night storm. Arthur was awake, huddled deep in his doorway, the familiar pangs of hunger his alarm clock. He was thinking about his dollar and the 99-cent coffee, a small beacon of hope in the morning ahead. And then he heard it. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration he felt in the soles of his feet before he could place the sound. It wasn't a truck or a bus. It was deeper, more menacing, more alive. The rumble grew steadily, multiplying, until it sounded like rolling thunder, even though the sky was clear. Windows started to rattle in their frames. People came out of their shops, wiping their hands on their aprons, peering down the street. Inside the diner, Silas looked up from his grill, annoyed by the noise. The sound grew into a deafening roar, an overwhelming wave of sound that consumed the entire street. And then they came into view. At first it was just one motorcycle, then two, then a dozen, then a whole river of them. They poured onto the main street, a tidal wave of polished chrome, black leather, and raw, untamed power. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating grace, their engines thundering in perfect, terrifying unison. 50 of them, maybe more. They were all patched members of the same club. On their backs, the same iconic, fearsome logo. They didn't just drive past. They slowed, and one by one they began to park. They lined both sides of the street, their bikes angled perfectly, a formidable barricade of steel. The engines cut out, one by one, and the sudden, profound silence was even more menacing than the noise had been. The entire street fell quiet. Shopkeepers froze in their doorways. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks. The town held its collective breath. At the head of the formation, the lead biker swung his leg off his bike. It was Preacher. He took off his helmet and scanned the street, his eyes calm and purposeful. He saw Arthur, huddled in his doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Preacher's gaze softened for a fraction of a second before he turned his attention to the diner. With a silent gesture, his men began to dismount, their boots hitting the pavement with a solid, unified thud. They didn't speak. They just stood by their bikes, a silent army of giants, their presence a suffocating weight on the small town's morning routine. Preacher walked across the street, his boots making a slow, deliberate cadence on the asphalt. The bell on the diner door jingled as he pushed it open. Every head inside snapped toward him. The cheerful morning chatter died instantly. Silas, spatula in hand, stared at him, his face paling. Preacher ignored him for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Then he walked to the counter and placed a crisp, new $100 bill on it. "I'm here to pay a debt," Preacher said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the silent room. He turned and looked at the patrons, his gaze hard. "Last night, one of your neighbors was thrown out of here. A man you all see every day. A man you've judged and dismissed." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Last night, I was stranded in that storm. My bike was dead. I was frustrated and I was stuck. And that man, that homeless man you call a bum, he walked out into the pouring rain and offered me his last dollar." A ripple of murmurs went through the diner. Eyes widened. People exchanged shocked glances. Silas's jaw was slack. "He has nothing," Preacher continued, his voice rising with controlled passion. "And he offered it to a stranger who looked like he had everything. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just saw someone in trouble and he acted." Preacher pointed a thick finger at Silas. You threw him out. You denied him a moment of warmth because he was an inconvenience, because he didn't fit. You saw a dirty coat. I saw more honor in that man's little finger than I've seen in a room full of so-called respectable people." Just then, another biker walked in. He was older, with silver in his beard and the word Doc stitched on his vest. He had been watching Arthur from across the street. He walked up beside Preacher. "That man's a soldier," Doc said, his voice raspy but firm. "I was a corpsman in the Navy. I know the look, the way he carries himself even now, the way his eyes are always scanning. He's seen things. He's one of us, a brother left behind." The reveal hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Arthur wasn't just a bum. He was a man of honor, a veteran, a hero who had fallen on hard times. The testimony of these two men, outsiders whose own code of honor was fierce and unwavering, was more powerful than any sermon. Preacher turned his attention back to the whole diner. "We're here to settle his tab," he announced. Then he looked straight at Silas. "And to buy him breakfast, whatever he wants, and a meal for every one of my brothers here. Put it all on this." He tapped the $100 bill. "And keep the change. You're gonna need it for the new windows." The last part was said with a chilling quietness that was far more threatening than a shout. The recognition began not with a grand gesture, but with a simple act of profound respect. Preacher walked back out the door, the little bell jingling mockingly in the tense silence. He crossed the street to where Arthur was still huddled, trying to make himself small, overwhelmed by the impossible scene. The other bikers parted silently to let their leader through. Preacher knelt down, a gesture that was shocking in its humility, bringing his massive frame down to Arthur's level. "Arthur," he said gently. "We're here for you." He gestured back toward the diner. "Come on, let's get you some breakfast. It's the least we can do." Arthur looked at the 50 stoic, leather-clad men watching him, their expressions unreadable but for a universal, undeniable current of respect. He looked at Preacher's outstretched hand. Hesitantly, he took it. Preacher helped him to his feet, his grip strong and steadying. As Arthur stood, a few of the bikers nodded at him. One of them, a giant of a man with a beard braided into 2 thick ropes, said, "Thank you for your service." His voice a low rumble. They escorted him across the street like a king, a phalanx of leather and steel. When they entered the diner, the patrons who had laughed at him the night before now looked down at their plates, their faces flushed with shame. The waitress, Chloe, who had previously ignored him, rushed forward with a coffee pot, her hands trembling slightly. "Here, sir," she said, her voice full of a respect he hadn't heard directed at him in a decade. "Let me get you a fresh cup." Preacher led Arthur to the best booth in the house, the one by the window, and sat him down. "Order anything you want, Arthur." Everything you want. The bikers filled every other seat in the diner, their sheer numbers and silent presence transforming the greasy spoon into a hall of judgment. Arthur, overwhelmed, just pointed to the first item on the menu. "The Grand Slam," Preacher called out to Silas, who was moving behind the counter like a terrified automaton. "Give the man a Grand Slam, and 50 more for my brothers." While they waited for the food, 2 of the bikers left and returned a short time later with bags from a local department store. They contained new boots, thick wool socks, warm jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, and a winter coat that looked like it could withstand an Arctic expedition. They were placed on the seat next to Arthur without a word. After he had eaten his first full, hot meal in what felt like an eternity, Preacher laid one more thing on the table. It was a black leather vest, identical to the ones the bikers wore, but with one crucial difference. The back was clean, save for a single custom-stitched patch at the top. It read, in simple white letters, "Honor." "This is for you," Preacher said. "It doesn't make you one of us. That's a hard road. But it lets everyone know you are protected by us, that you are a friend, that your honor has been recognized." The community, which had been watching the entire spectacle from a safe distance, began to understand. The sheriff, who had often told Arthur to move along, now stood across the street, just watching, his expression thoughtful. The transformation was complete. Arthur was no longer invisible. He was seen, recognized, and fiercely, terrifyingly protected. The sun was high in the sky by the time the bikers finished their meals. They had paid Silas not with the crisp $100 bill, but with a mountain of coins and small bills they'd all pooled, an intentionally inconvenient gesture that forced the humiliated owner to count out every last cent under their watchful eyes. Arthur, now dressed in his new, warm clothes, the black vest fitting comfortably over his flannel shirt, stood outside on the sidewalk. He felt solid. The gnawing hunger was gone, replaced by the pleasant weight of a good meal. The bone-deep chill had been banished by layers of clean, dry fabric. But the most significant change was internal. The heavy cloak of invisibility had been lifted. When people looked at him now, they didn't look away. They saw a man flanked by an army, a man who had been publicly, emphatically, declared worthy. The bikers began to mount their bikes, the quiet street once again filled with the creak of leather and the clink of metal. They moved with an unhurried, deliberate purpose. Preacher walked over to Arthur, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. He pressed a thick envelope into Arthur's hand. "That's a collection from the boys," he said, cutting off any protest before it could start. "First month's rent on a room at the motel down the street, and enough to keep you fed for a while. It's not charity, Arthur. It's a payback, an investment in honor." Arthur looked down at the envelope, then up at the formidable man before him. Words failed him. A simple thank you felt laughably inadequate for the profound shift that had occurred. He could only nod, his eyes stinging with tears for the first time in years. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming, heart-cracking gratitude. Preacher seemed to understand. He simply squeezed Arthur's shoulder once more. "You see Doc over there?" he said, nodding toward the biker medic. "He's got some contacts at the VA hospital a couple towns over. He's gonna make some calls. Get you looked at. No soldier gets left behind. Not on our watch." Then came the roar. One by one, the 50 engines ignited. A thunderous chorus that was no longer menacing. It was a declaration. It was the sound of loyalty. It was a promise that this town, this street, and this man would not be forgotten. Preacher swung his leg over his own bike, put on his helmet, and gave Arthur one last, final nod. The bikes pulled out, a disciplined and powerful procession, and thundered down the main street, leaving a strange, vibrating silence in their wake. Arthur stood on the sidewalk, the envelope heavy in one hand, the memory of their presence a palpable force around him. The diner door opened, and Chloe, the waitress, came out, holding a steaming travel cup. "On the house," she said, her smile genuine and free of pity. "For the road. Or, for whenever he took it. His new life beginning with a simple cup of coffee. The very thing he had been denied less than 24 hours before. He was no longer a ghost. He was Arthur. And he was, for the first time in a very long time, home.